In parts 1 and 2 of this series, we saw how Romney, Gingrich, and Santorum, with a little help from Senator Graham, justify removing the long-held restraints on government and military power to deny due process and justice to Americans and others. Central to their arguments is the idea that our established laws and courts are insufficient to meet the expediency and secrecy required by war. By pulling on the lever of fear for our security, or our support for those who sacrifice themselves in our armed forces, the compelling case is made: the government must have no cautious restraints. Do not think that to fight in the cause of liberty is to weaken our resolve to capture and prosecute the guilty. There are hundreds of cases of terrorism and related activities in which the courts have successfully won prosecution. The history of our wars, civil and otherwise, include an abundance of enemies successfully tried in both civilian courts and military tribunals. The key distinction is that the charges and evidence were brought forth and the law was applied. The fight for liberty is not an appeal to let the guilty go free, but rather a stand to ensure that the innocent are protected. If war can remove the restraints on administrative power, then the first goal of the executive will be to promote and extend whatever conflict exists, thereby liberating the imagination of the president to whatever mischief he wills. When the people tire of the bloody and costly haze of one war, then another enemy springs up, a new existential threat to prop up the excesses of presidential discretion. Even as we end the conflicts in Iraq and draw down Afghanistan, we have already heard the dire warnings of the impending confrontations with Iran and whispers of the growing military and economic influence of China. Wars and rumors of wars describes our point at any given time in the cycle of perpetual conflict, and we must put an end to it. With an understanding of the issues at hand, the implications and dangers of the National Defense Authorization Act, the false dichotomy of the human rights of citizens versus non-citizens, and the unending cycle of wars as a means of extending power, we can see the need for fighting back. On the 18th of January of 2012, Texas Representative Rand Paul introduced a bill that would repeal the odious provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act, a first step towards the restoration of our freedoms. Here are his remarks in their entirety.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to introduce a very simple piece of legislation to repeal the infamous Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, quietly signed into law by the President on New Year's Day. What a way to usher in the new year. Section 1021 essentially codifies into law the very dubious claim of presidential authority under 2001 authorization for the use of military force to indefinitely detain American citizens without access to legal representation or due process of law. Section 1021 provides for the possibility of the U.S. military acting as a kind of police force on U.S. soil, apprehending terror suspects, including Americans, and whisking them off to an undisclosed location indefinitely. No right to attorney, no right to trial, no day in court. This is precisely the kind of egregious distortion of justice that Americans have always ridiculed in so many dictatorships overseas. A great man named Solzhenitsyn became the hero of so many of us when he exposed the Soviet Union's extensive Gulag system. Is this really the kind of a United States we want to create in name of fighting terrorism? Some have argued that nothing in Section 1021 explicitly mandates holding Americans without trial, but it employs vague language, radically expanding the detention authority to include anyone who has substantially supported certain terrorist groups or associated forces. No one has defined what those terms mean. What is an associated force? Sadly, too many of my colleagues are too willing to undermine our Constitution to support such outrageous legislation. One senator even said about American citizens being picked up under this section of the NDAA, quote, "When they say, 'I want a lawyer,' you tell them, 'Shut up. You don't get a lawyer,'" close quote. Is this acceptable in someone who has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution? Mr. Speaker, of course, I recognize how critical it is that we identify and apprehend those who are suspected of plotting attacks against Americans. But why do we have so little faith in our judicial system? Have we not tried in civilian court and won convictions of hundreds of individuals for terrorist or related activities? I fully support continuing to do so. But let us not abandon what is so unique and special about our system of government in the process. I hope my colleagues will join my effort to overturn this shameful Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act.
By taking time out of a presidential campaign to introduce this important legislation, Dr. Paul delivers on his commitment to press for the ideals of justice and freedom, proof of his resolve for ending other preceding laws which also violate constitutional bounds, the Patriot Act, the TSA, and the Military Commissions Act. The polarizing discourse of modern politics would magnify the importance of issues which have immediate portent but are transient in their effect. The economy, jobs, taxes, all show an immediacy which calls for their place at the center of debate, but whose effects will be tempered by the inevitable fluctuations over the decades. The loss of our freedoms, however, will have a progressive and unrelenting course if we do not immediately right our sails and recover our bearing. We must look to those principles of liberty, justice, and the rights of man embodied in our Constitution, and select leaders who will reverence and fight for the same.